energy. So any sexuality that is solely for the sake of pleasure is actually not considered Tantra, according to the original text. Not saying that there's anything wrong with sexuality, but if the pleasure aspect of sexuality is foremost, it's not considered Tantra. Again, there's nothing wrong with the pleasure, but it's considered secondary to the ultimate goal of liberation. Now, Kundalini energy and sexual energy are essentially one and the same. It's the same energy that we're talking about. They both begin at the base of the spine, and it's the same energy that we're trying to essentially awaken. And using our sexuality, our sexual energy, in a conscious way is a very good way to awaken the Kundalini energy. Now, it's not the only way. You can also do intense pranayama breath work, yoga asanas. There are paths of devotion and study. There are other ways this energy can be awakened, but using our sexual energy is a very effective way to essentially remove any blockages that we've collected through our lives in order to awaken this energy. So the actual sexual practices in Tantra, this is not the majority of the philosophy, because the sexual practices in Tantra were actually kept very secret and were reserved for very devoted practitioners that had reached a certain stage in their spiritual development. So these were not accessible, and you really don't find very much mention of them in the tantric texts. But we do know that there were tantric sexual rituals. And of course, our sexual energy, or otherwise known as our life force energy, is the basis for all life on Earth. And we were all born as a result of this primal and sacred energy. And because this energy is so sacred and so primal and so powerful, these tantric teachers understood that really only the sincerest practitioners should have access to this information, which is probably why there aren't so many texts that really go into the details of these sexual rites. Now, the fact that modern day Tantra has become predominantly focused on the sexual aspect, I think, has to do a lot with where our modern day society is regarding sex. Our sexual energy is very repressed. Even though we kind of think that we're very liberal and open regarding sex, I find that people are very repressed and still very embarrassed about their sexual energy. And there's so much guilt and shame surrounding our thoughts about our sexual energy. So it's almost as if because we've repressed it on so many levels, there's almost this obsession with sex, which you can see, of course, in the obsession regarding porno and porn addiction, which is a very serious problem today. So I think that is why Tantra has essentially, it's now being classified as something which is predominantly sexual. Now, I also think that it has to do with the fact that, when Westerners were essentially traveling to India in the early 1900s, those that were essentially receiving the first initiations by Indian gurus and tantrikas, female tantric gurus, like I said, these rituals were sacred and secret. And they were coming back to the West and incorporating them on different levels into their teachings. So I think that that's part of the reason why we see this association with Tantra and sex, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But it seems that a large part of the Tantric philosophy in the West has been lost, which is really important to have as a base for this practice. Because if you don't have a strong spiritual foundation and you haven't purified yourself through meditation, through breath work, the chances of misuse of these sexual and tantric practices is tremendously increased. And that is a dangerous thing. And we see it happening, unfortunately. So we do have to try to maintain the purity of this practice through having a strong spiritual foundation. Now, I'm going to briefly go into some of the neo-tantric modern practices. Neo-tantric meaning, these practices have become more modern, somewhat changed from the original tantric scriptures. So some of them have to do with incorporating breath, sound, movement into lovemaking. So the breath, essentially, as you can also see in tantric texts and yoga, has a very strong effect on our spiritual, physical body. It helps us open up our body to new levels of experience, and it also helps us stay present in the actual act of lovemaking. Sound, so creating sound as you are lovemaking is also very important because our sound is very, very connected to our genital system. So if we are using sound, it is much easier for us to open up our genitals. And as women giving birth, it's very important to use sound, to make noise, to open the mouth, to create ooh sounds and ah sounds, because this actually has a direct effect on the woman's ability to open up her birth canal for birth. So in the same way, in lovemaking, you also want to use sound. And of course, movement. Movement is moving your hips, moving your body, engaging your body in this act of lovemaking. Now, it's not about showing off and, putting on a show and acting sexy, which is something that a lot of women think they have to do. It's more about activating our sexual energy, both for men and women. And that means being aware of the energy and being aware of the movement of that energy. And we are actually the only ones that can move our own energy. So we have this kind of thought that someone else is responsible for turning us on. And this is false. We are really the only ones that can turn ourselves on. We're the only ones that can really move our energy. So that's something that we need to be aware of and to really take back our responsibility for moving that energy. And staying present, which is something that Tantra, Neo-Tantra, talks a lot about, is being present in the act of lovemaking. So not fantasizing about, the secretary in your office when you're making love to your wife, but rather opening your eyes, looking at the person that you're making love to, in order to create a deeper connection and to create deeper intimacy, which is something that's very hard for many people, especially men, because men have been trained to disconnect from their emotion. So Tantra really helps people reconnect to their emotion so that they can be present in the act of lovemaking, so that they can look into their partner's eyes, so that they can incorporate their breathing into the act of lovemaking and allow whatever emotions that come up, whether it be the sense of uncomfortableness or weirdness or whatever it is that comes up, or even anger, sadness. Okay, so when we start to learn to stay present in the act of lovemaking, different emotions are going to come through us, but these emotions have been repressed. And in order for us to really, really dive deep into lovemaking and be present and create deep intimacy with our partner, we have to learn to do these practices. We have to cultivate these amazing practices. So there's a lot more that we could talk about. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but we are going to wrap up for today. So thank you so much for joining us on Divine Couples. Feel free to check us out at www.divine-couples.com, and our social media page on Instagram is divine.couples, adding intimacy, passion, and healing to your lives. Thanks for joining us on Divine Couples. I am your host, Naomi Slater.
Join us next time to continue your journey in exploring the depths of your life force energy. Until then, this has been your host, Naomi Slater. If you have any more questions on this subject, feel free to reach out. Follow her on Instagram at divine.couples. And to see all of her offerings, visit her website at theworldwideweb.divine-couples.com.